And so.
Yeah, where is it?
And so this one is for this
Wow, should I meet this?
lawn. So that's, so I don't know. I'll have to say one and a half.
I'm sure you
Yeah, no, it's different stuff, and then, no, it's still okay, all right, sorry. All right, we'll take it as two, and then.
And so when Rob does
My husband wrote a book on it.
no, I don't want to use Rob, like,
And doing that, the I have to be this
Rob should they use video off.
Oh, yeah.
It was a cool set.
Right.
One of the
Different colors, yeah, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is three, okay, so I did, like,
Yeah, that
did number three. Yeah, there's number two.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
oh, yeah,
okay, thank you so much.
when it came to. Doing the index. Lots of money, but I don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We live in.
Right, thank you. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, look downstairs when you're.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Colin. Bye.
Right.
For those of you joining us online, our presentation will begin in about 10 minutes. I'm doing tech today, so text me if you have any problems. I'm a little bit worried, but I got some supporters here in the front row. So I hope you can all hear and see everything okay. We look forward to welcoming Dr. Parkinson to the lectern shortly. Thanks. How are you, Barry?
Spelling bee. Yeah. Which I said to do, I said on the set. How far we fallen to have a spelling bee on the sun?
So that's all right. And then the second we have. All right, so yeah, this is a very church like, the first rules in that passing was. And what do we make it?
Right.
You know, it's like all of the.
Right, exactly. Rule it out first. Yeah. Yes, right. Right. People gravitate that way, right from here. So to west. Right, oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm good. That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's called up among the notice, be careful. Right, right. Right, never, never. I would go one further. That means you're actually. Oh, that. He sounds like that.
Yeah, right.
For this year, I'm Charles, I'm actually on. They're putting me up right on top of Jefferson's Mountain. Down from the house. Yeah, they're. Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, I'm the only one. So. But. We talk about why we out there. Really have my own appearance. Block the bears. Here they come. That's nice. Yeah, my PhD's from you.
Okay.
So it's fun to be back. 20 years. Back. Yeah, that next year. I'm impressed. Lovely. Sunny. Right.
I understand.
This-
I was barely paying attention to them, but I was pleasure to talk to them. Found out they were there to see how it was done. Quarterback was actually selected.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, injured.
Yeah. And yeah. I said it was probably nice, so saying, God, no fact about two guys.
Yeah, so I want to talk about music again. I get to talk to students. Like to talk. But. Mixed marriage.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. All right. Exactly. All right.
Actually, I remember this.
Well,
Yeah. gonna go to the beach down there.
Hello, hi everyone. As many of you can tell, I am not Deirdre Anderson. Our executive director is taking on another role today. She's actually our tech director for today in the back. And yeah, round of applause. I think she's doing a great job. But welcome to everyone here in person. Welcome to everyone who is joining us from home to our second lecture of our 2024-2025 lecture series, Revisiting the American Revolution. Today we have Professor Robert G. Parkinson joining us. We're very excited. And so my name is Victoria McCallion. I am the new museum educator here. And I figured I'd just give us a couple little fun updates about what we've been up to since we last saw all of you at our last lecture. So this past Thursday and Friday, we welcomed 75 fifth graders to our first of many fifth grade field trips for the fall. So East Elementary School came to Old Ordinary, Old Ship Church. We did a lovely walking tour with them. It's a great day, one of our favorite days, and we couldn't do it without volunteers. So if anyone here is interested in being involved in just an overall joyous day of education and talking about colonial history, then we would love to have you be a part of it. And then, of course, we have a couple of other exciting things coming up in November. On November 1st and 2nd and November 8th and 9th, the first 2 weekends in November, we have our candlelight tours. Tickets are up for those. And then back by popular demand on November 13th, we have our annual harvest dinner. Tickets are also up for that. So if either of those sound exciting, we would love to have you. And so to do our lovely introduction for our lovely presenter today is Jerry Scopo, our board member and Rev 250 committee member. So without further ado, Jerry.
Thank you, Victoria. Hello, everyone. My name is Jerry Scobo, and it's my pleasure to serve on the Society's Rev 250 committee. As Gordon discussed at our premier lecture, we are fast approaching two significant anniversaries in America. The upcoming 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and in 2026, America's 250th birthday. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reintroduce history to our community and to build stronger foundations of shared historical understanding. At the Hingham Historical Society, we believe deeply that increased historical literacy strengthens our democracy, and we are proud to lead Hingham's commemoration planning. Of course, the infamous and official start of the Revolutionary War was the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and this upcoming April 19th, 2025, marks the 250th anniversary of that day that forever changed the course of American history. It will be a powerful and patriotic spectacle as, in the early hours of the morning of the 19th, thousands will gather to watch the commemorative reenactment of that significant battle. For those of you who have never attended Lexington's reenactment of the battle, it is a remarkable and immersive experience, and what better year to experience either again or for the first time than on its 250th anniversary. The Hingham Historical Society will be offering an exciting opportunity to attend this event on the morning of April 19th, 2025. The bus to the battle will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to travel with the society via luxury bus to Lexington in the early hours of the morning to witness the reenactment, followed by either a traditional Lexington pancake breakfast or a champagne breakfast at the Inn at Hastings Park. We hope you will join us for this upcoming opportunity to be in the very place that the Revolutionary War began on its 250th anniversary. Tickets will be going on sale before the holidays. Now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Robert G. Parkinson. Professor Parkinson is an associate professor at Binghamton University, where he teaches about the American Revolution, the American colonial era, Native American history, and the history of American slavery and race in early America. He has written 7 books about early American history, including The Common Cause, Creating Nation and Race in the American Revolution, 13 Clocks, How Rights United the Colonies and made the Declaration of Independence, and his most recent publication, The Heart of American Darkness. His works offer deep insight into how race and racial prejudices impacted not just the course of the Revolutionary War and the movement for independence, but the very foundation of our country. I hope you will join me in offering a warm welcome to Professor Parkinson. Thank you for joining us at the Hingham Heritage Museum.
Okay. All right, Deirdre?
I'm getting a request to change the speaker view
Okay,
so that people can see you in full screen,
okay,
but I'm waiting for my lifeline here.
okay. All right, so my bona fides, right? And this is important, I know, because it's New England. So when I was 3, my family moved to Hanover. And we were there, we lived all over the country, but we were in Hanover when I was 3 to 7. And most weekends, my job was to convince my mother to either go east to Plymouth Rock or west to Lexington Green. And that's why I'm right here today. So when Max reached out to me and said, would you, hey, from Hingham? I said, absolutely from Hingham, I'm coming here. So 45 years is in the making. Also in those times, so this was not the bicentennial, I'd like to say. It was just right after the bicentennial, but it was Yastrzemski, Lynn, Rice, Fenway Park. And so so I know this is important to establish this, right? So I have roots here, South Shore Baptist Church we went to in Hingham. So I have roots here, and Red Sox, right? My wife is a Yankee fan, so do I've been putting up with tremendous, terrible things. We were in Boston yesterday, and she took great delight in the lights being out at Fenway Park. So I just wanted to, before we got started, I wanted to establish this. So it is my pleasure to be back here. It's a whole thing to sort of feel like we're going to go by my childhood house later on today. It's something to be here. My mother is entirely jealous. She's in Texas now. She's entirely jealous that she's not here with us today.
Correct.
How are we doing?
Give me 1 minute.
No problem.
Go on.
I should ask for questions now. Should I ask for questions now? Do you believe me? Right. So, right. So I am thrilled to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, because of the race in the colonies, this situation of establishing the colonies under these conditions currently developed into the Civil War barely 100 years later.
Right.
I mean, I'm sort of acknowledging that.
Yeah.
You give that premise.
Right. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is the creation of the Union and how fragile and how the glue is so thin and barely dry on it, even from the very beginning. So is it any surprise that the Union falls apart 80 years later? No, not really. It's never really. There are times in which that glue sets and it becomes more robust, but not often. So yes, there's a lot of sort of, just keep that in mind, that this is about union making, and it's hard work. All right. And I also know too that you had Mary Beth Norton here a couple of weeks ago, and historians don't always agree. And so I'm going to say some things that Mary Beth doesn't really agree with me about some things about 1774. We don't see exactly eye to eye about what's going on in America, and how I think she sees it more half full and I see it more half empty about the potential for making the cause common and how much hard work it has to be. And so if you want to ask me some questions that maybe she answered or suggested a few weeks ago, I'm more than happy to do that. But historians don't always read evidence in the same kind of way.
Okay.
Ready?
Yep, and if you can speak right into the mic.
I will do my best. I am a walker, so I will do my best. Okay. All right. We start with John Adams, local guy. We're good?
Yep, we're good.
All right, let's see about this. It's not exactly working.
Nope.
There we go. So as the founding generation is dying off, people get extraordinary. I mean, we see this with World War II veterans, about how there is a sprint to try to find out what happened from them before they're all gone. And in 1818, a Baltimore publisher named Hezekiah Niles reaches out to a number of the leaders of the revolutionary generation and says, how did you do this? Tell us how you brought this about. And so John Adams, who has been thinking about that question for a long time, especially without his presence, his centrality in the whole thing, responds to a letter that he gets from Hezekiah Niles, and he describes how the revolution came to be. And this response in 1818 is a very important reflection on what happened in the 1770s, and it captured the mind of a lot of historians in the 19th and 20th century and how we think about the narrative of the American Revolution. Adams writes this: the colonies had grown up under constitutions of government so different, and they were so great a variety of religions. They were composed of so many different nations. Their customs, manners, and habits had so little resemblance, and their intercourse had been so rare, and their knowledge of each other so imperfect, that to unite them in the same principles and theory and the same system of action was certainly a very difficult enterprise. And this is what we would call today a nice little humble brag from John Adams, because he's basically saying, dude, it was hard, but we pulled it off, baby, right? So it was a very difficult enterprise. And he says at the end, after that passage, the complete accomplishment of it, the Union, in so short a time and by such simple means, was perhaps a singular example in the history of mankind. 13 clocks were made to strike together, a perfection of mechanism which no artist had ever before effected. And for men, especially of the Enlightenment generation, when they start to invoke things like artists, they're also talking about God. And so he's I mean, again, this is about, dude, it was hard and we pulled it off. And 13 clocks were made to strike together. Now, I'll come back to something that he said while Jefferson's writing the Declaration of Independence, while Jefferson is sitting at his desk in Philadelphia writing this, when he says, I don't know if we can pull off this 13 clocks striking together thing. He uses that exact metaphor at the time in 1776, but this is in 1818. This reflection is incredibly important. He's right about a lot of things, but there are things that I want to challenge John Adams on about how it is that this came to be. Were 13 clocks timed perfectly? 13 clocks, of course, meaning the 13 colonies. How did 13 colonies come to declare independence unanimously? How was the cause made common throughout North America? Because, as he is saying, there are so many forces pulling the clocks away from one another or mistiming them entirely. In this, I want to talk about how questions. I've said the word how several times already. How questions more than why questions. I'm more of a process kind of historian. I get really interested in the how of how things worked in the 18th century, which is not far away from why they worked the way they did, but thinking about how the colonies united is a step away from why they did so. And although the two things are related to one another. So I want to talk a little bit about how, again, is this a work of an artist, sort of a miraculous kind of deistic thing, or is there something else going on here? So I want to talk about John Adams, the first part of that reflection. The colonies were so different from one another. And he is exactly right about that. They did not know each other. They didn't like each other. You've seen this before, right? This is a cartoon that Benjamin Franklin draws in 1754. And whenever I show this to my students, the purpose of this is colonists in the 1750s and 60s and 70s would choose or die over join. They are much more comfortable with the or die part of than it is the join. That they have grown up in such different worlds from one another that the idea of joining the snake together is so utterly foreign to them. And there are many, many things in the 1770s pushing them away from one another. These are the things that John Adams mentions in his passage, right? Their religions are so different. Their customs are so different. Their habits are so different. Their manners are so different. Their intercourse or their economic sort of interactions with one another are entirely different. He's right. This you see on the right here, all the different kind of religious denominations, they don't trust one another. When John Adams gets to Philadelphia for the first time, for the First Continental Congress, a number of Quakers pull him aside and kind of get in his face and say, you know, we haven't forgotten that you Puritan turkeys hanged Quakers in the 17th century. If we join up with you, are you going to do that again to us? So that happened 80, 90 years before. And now they haven't forgotten that in Pennsylvania, that what you guys in Hingham did, not in Hingham, but in Massachusetts did to Quakers. Religion, we're skeptical of joining together in this union. And I want to talk, so there are several different things that are going on in the 1770s that are making it much harder for the clocks to strike together. And this group of things is one. These kind of basic social structures are driving them in different directions. That's one. In the 1770s, there are also a tremendous amount of internal problems, small-scale social unrest that are driving people to fight with one another. There's civil unrest in North Carolina. And you might think, well, you know, that sounds like social unrest. There's social unrest in Boston. But sometimes that pushes people in the opposite directions of how you're going to need them once war breaks out in England. There's a fight that's known as the regulator movement in North Carolina, and the people who are taking the authoritarian or the anti-governor position are the ones that are going to end up being loyalists, and the ones who are threatening to shoot them with cannons are the ones that are going to be patriots. So you can't predict how these kinds of teams are going to happen. New York and New Hampshire are fighting desperately over what becomes the Vermont territory. There are Ethan Allen, New Yorkers are issuing death penalty warrants out for Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys arrest. They're going to need them pretty soon. You have all sorts of boundary disputes between Connecticut and Pennsylvania over what becomes what's today Joe Biden country in Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. Connecticut says that's theirs. Pennsylvania says that's theirs. They are shooting one another, and it's not a lot of it, but there's a couple of people that die in what becomes the Yankee-Pennamite War in the 1770s. And this forms a core of the newest work that I've done, Heart of American Darkness. Virginia and Pennsylvania are fighting desperately over what Pittsburgh's going to be. Virginia says it's theirs. Pennsylvania says it's theirs. Native peoples are concerned when there are armed groups of people roaming the streets of Pittsburgh, jailing one another. There are government officials saying it's Pennsylvania, government officials saying it's Virginia. They're shooting sort of around one another, and that leads to unrest all over Ohio. At the time that the First Continental Congress is sitting in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. Whew. So there's all sorts of that. So that's two. Not great. Three, slavery. In the 1770s, there is an unsettled feeling throughout the Atlantic, Caribbean, and North American colonies about what is going to happen to slavery. The 1770s is the greatest decade thus far of the transatlantic slave trade. So there are more people who are being taken from Africa in British ships and gone to the Caribbean and then also secondarily to the North American colonies in greater numbers than they'd ever seen before. So the commitment to slavery is deepening more than we've ever seen it before in the 1770s. And I'm going to show you some of that stuff in just a second. But let me finish this slide. The 1770s sees the highest percentage of African Americans as a higher percentage of the entire American population than it will until the Civil War. So there are more people of color of African descent walking around in North America as a higher percentage of population than there ever will be before. And in 1772, however, there is a very important case that goes to the Supreme Court in England, the Court of Chancery, what we call their Supreme Court. And the findings of the Somerset case, James Somerset is an enslaved person who's from Virginia, and he's taken to England. And when he gets there, when his master, Stuart, tries to bring him back, he says, no, by bringing me to England, you freed me because there's no such thing as slavery in England, which is the exact terms of the case for the Dred Scott case, although it's Missouri and Illinois. And the British court finds in the opposite direction of the US Supreme Court in 1757, or 1857, I'm sorry, I'm stuck in the 70s, and which is, yes, by bringing him to England, you have emancipated him. And that case, which is referred to at the time, the name of the case, which becomes a very popular thing, is called the Great Negro Cause. That's the name of the case. The Somerset case, abolitionists in England broadcast that this is a transformative and landmark case, and there is no such thing as slavery in England. And what will that mean for its colonies? Well, we don't really know. So England's commitment to slavery is deepening commercially, but at the same time, its political commitment is a little bit up in the air. And so that's another thing that's making some people, if you are a slave master in Virginia or South Carolina or now Georgia, you're concerned about what role your property might have in going forward in the future if you stay in this empire, right? These are images I've taken from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which we now which is a database now of more than 35,000 ship manifests. If you go to slavevoyages.org, and if you see this, you might not be able to see it. Maybe on Zoom you can even see it a little bit better than here in the room. But these, every time you see a dot on this, it is a slave ship going from Africa to the New World, either to South America, Central America, the Caribbean, or North America. The size of the dot corresponds to the size of the ship, and the color is the if there are 50 slaves aboard, it's a small dot. If there are 500 slaves on board, it's a large dot on this map. The color also corresponds to what country the ship's captain and crew are from. So the red dots are British ships. So you see a lot of red dots on this map. Those are British or British American captains and crews. All right, so this is 1773, right? Boston Tea Party time. This is 1774. Look at all those ships. 1775. And 1776. Lots and lots. And this is sort of blown up from 1776. Look at all the dots. And you can do the website for this is called slavevoyages.org, and I've screenshotted these things, but you can watch them move in time, and the speed of the dots also corresponds to the speed at which they cross the Atlantic. It's a fantastic way to visualize what's going on here. And sometimes when you see a dot go really, really slow across the ocean, that means it took some months to get across, which means that there's trouble aboard that ship. Right. So you see all these things. It feels like you could almost walk across the Atlantic Ocean on board these ships. So slavery is really important. And yet, what does it mean? And you might have heard in the last 4 or 5 years or so some controversy about this. The 1619 Project, that became a very important moment in publishing and kind of in politics in 2019 and 2020, one of the arguments that it made was that this was the reason why the 13 clocks struck together, that to protect slavery from this wobbliness that may be going on, to protect slaveholders' investment was the reason. And since then, people have backed off from that a little bit, and I'm also backing off from that as the reason as well. It is a reason. It's an important reason. Slavery itself is important, but also, this is my fourth point. There are people who are getting very much involved in the patriot movement to get rid of slavery, who don't want that property protected, who don't want American investment in slavery to continue and get deeper and deeper. They would like to see the slave trade, those ships not coming to America, and are taking some political steps to try to make that happen. So if we think about what are the motivations for bringing people to the Continental Congress, some are there. If you are Arthur Middleton from South Carolina, or you are Henry Lawrence from South Carolina, you're probably there to protect the slaveholding economic and property interests of your constituents. If you are there from other places, you may have Samuel Hopkins from Rhode Island, for example, or the Adams cousins from Massachusetts. You may be there to try to squeeze slavery out of America. Several colonies have tried to pass measures that would tax those the enslaved people coming into the colonies to such a degree that would make it financially a losing proposition. That's their way of trying to do that. Several colonies have done that. All of those measures had been blocked by the king, which is going to feature in the Declaration of Independence. There had been a number of freedom suits filed in courts seeking liberty by individual African Americans, especially in New England. Many using the language of natural rights and liberty, some of the language that is employed by the American resistance movement, to try to sue for their freedom. And those suits are almost all successful on a local level. The First Continental Congress bans the Atlantic slave trade as part of the Continental Association or the big boycott. And there's another quote here from Thomas Jefferson at the bottom of this slide. It's an important quote. In August of 1774, as a couple of weeks before the First Continental Congress is going to sit in Philadelphia, the pamphlet that makes Thomas Jefferson famous is called A Summary View of the Rights of British American Colonists, right? This is what establishes his kind of writing credentials. This is why John Adams wants him to write the Declaration of Independence. And in that pamphlet, Jefferson says, the abolition of American domestic slavery is the great object of desire. The abolition of slavery is the great object of desire in these colonies where it was unhappily introduced there in its infant state. That's going to also feature in the Declaration of Independence. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it's necessary to exclude from all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts by prohibitions and by imposing duties which might amount to a prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative. The king has stopped us from abolishing slavery. The great object of desire. Remember that. This is a year and a few months before the fighting at Lexington and Concord. For Jefferson to say that in the summer of 1774 suggests that there are a lot of people in America who want to get rid of slavery. There's some that want to protect it. They don't like each other. They don't know each other. There's all these things going on. There's a lot driving these colonies apart. In 1774, I know, Mary Beth told you this is a movement for revolution. I think there's problems, there's weaknesses, there's structural problems in that movement that could make that structure not so strong going forward. Yes, there's people talking about, especially after the news of the coercive acts becomes known in the summer of 1774. There is a movement for revolution, but there's a lot of things that might drive that apart. We don't know how this is going to turn out, and the odds against this are high. And then there's the last one. There's a strong loyalist counter argument that starts to make its presence known in the winter of 1774. It had been sort of dormant before that. A lot of loyalists who might want to, who didn't think it was, they didn't think it was important for them. I mean, it was in many ways, I think of a lot of loyalists sort of like in 2016, after Trump's election, when Barack Obama's sitting there and he's kind of shaking his head like, how did we get here? How did this happen? Right? What? I think a lot of loyalists before 1774 were like, well, and then how do we get here? Right? Wow, this took me by surprise. And so then at that point, they begin to pick up their pens and start to write very effective, very popular pamphlets that are saying, don't listen to those patriots and their definitions of liberty. Those are wrong definitions. They're going to lead you down the wrong path. They're only out for themselves. Franklin and Adams they're just trying to set themselves up as their own rulers. They are not to be trusted. So that is another thing that may poke holes in the patriot argumentation. Again, you see this, if you've seen the musical, now the musical's kind of old now, but if you've seen the musical, the loyalists are there to provide comedy. They seem silly and out of date and kind of old dudes saying dumb things just so Hamilton can seem cool and hip and relevant. That's not fair to the Samuel Seaburys of the world. And we also don't know how this is going to turn out. Remember, we don't know how this is going to turn out. And so they're writing all kinds of stuff that people are listening to and patriots are having to respond to. One of these is a series of letters by a man named Daniel Leonard is called Massachusettensis, which is doesn't really trip off of the tongue, but it gets such a following early on that John Adams panics and starts to write a reply under the pseudonym of Novanglis. And every time Leonard makes a point, Adams is going to try to refute it. And they had this kind of sort of running battle throughout the winter of 1774 and 75. John Adams does not feel confident enough not to enter into the lists and defend these things because he's really concerned that even in Boston, people are going to start to think that people like him and his cousin Sam might not have the right path. Or die. Later than we might think, or die. There are concerns. Okay, so what might be some glue? What might be some glue? This is important. So if I've told you all the things that might be driving them apart, they obviously didn't fall apart, at least not in 1776. So what, Parkinson? Explain to me how this might have come about. Okay, let's talk about the newspapers. All right. In another rehearsal of that letter that he writes to Hezekiah Niles, I told you John Adams has been thinking about this stuff for a while. He and Thomas Jefferson in their old age, in their 70s and 80s, have been having a long-running correspondence. And one of their main topics of that sort of lovely correspondence is about the meaning and the memory of the Revolution. And Adams writes in 1815, when he's in his late 70s, he says, you want to know where to find how the revolution came about? He says, here's where you look for it. Young men of letters in all the states, and by that he means young historians like myself, should undertake the laborious but certainly interesting and amusing task, well, I don't know about that, of searching and collecting all the records, pamphlets and newspapers, and even handbills of the 13 colonies to find out how the temper and views of the people had changed. That's where you want to know what happened in the revolution? That's where you go look. Go to print, go to especially the newspapers. So I said, all right, John, you think you know everything. I'm going to follow what you did. So I spent a whole big part of my youth and eyesight reading newspapers and trying to figure out what today we might call the timeline on our Twitter feed. What is it that people knew at the time? If Adams is right, this is where we need to go to find out the answers to this. Well, what were the things, the stories that they knew? And that's what I spent a couple of years of researching, because of lovely Places like the Hingham Historical Society or the American Antiquarian Society or the Massachusetts Historical Society, we have them all, right? Because people kept every single one. So we have just about every single weekly newspaper. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the newspapers as a potential site for glue. So this is where they're made. A lot of them in New England, some in the mid-Atlantic, a few in the South, but every port city basically had 1 or 2 or 3 newspapers. And again, Connecticut had Connecticut's not just the land of steady habits, but the land of steady printing. And in New Hampshire and especially in New England, this is where they would come out of. We have one reliable business book about where these newspapers would go, and it's from one Philadelphia newspaper called the Pennsylvania Journal. And so from that, we can determine, if you look at this is my favorite map that I've ever made, is all of the distribution routes. So from this book, which was written in code, so it took a long, fun time to decipher. You can see, the book was organized by delivery routes. You can see from this where riders would take this Philadelphia newspaper. So it wasn't just something where if it's made in Boston, it stays in Boston, or it's made in Philadelphia, it stays in Philadelphia. It would go all over the place. So the Pennsylvania Journal would travel down into New Jersey and travel into Eastern Shore of Maryland and travel into the Chesapeake. It was travel across the ocean. There are pages from an earlier book to Portugal, to England itself, to the Caribbean. And so you see, this is kind of like a spider's web out of these cities. So if they're made here, this is really where these guys would go, right? And there's about 36 of these newspapers at the time, and we have one of these spider webs. So if we had 35 more, and if I could do that, you would see kind of how this would move, and newspapers and information like this might move throughout the colony. And these are only subscribers, by the way, right? These are people who wrote to the printer and said, please send me one every week. Not all the ones that read them, who may have some of these are dropped off at taverns. They may have read them aloud. So these are the bare minimum of the ones that we know. Okay. This is the front page of a newspaper from the time, if you've seen this before. My wife, who is a 20th century historian, holds this against me. Newspapers were printed once a week, and they are 4 pages long. So it's one big sheet of paper folded in half, and it's sort of front page, 2 middle pages, and a back page. My 20th century, oh yeah, you only have multiple sections, and they come out every single day, and it's hundreds and hundreds of pages. So this is when I say that I read newspapers all the time, it wasn't that big a deal. Okay, so here's the front page. It could have been worse. If I was a 20th century historian, I would really be blind. But front page of a Virginia Gazette. What do you see here? What don't you see here? Pictures. What else? Ads. The ads are on the back page. They're going to be just as boring. Anything else? No headlines, no art really at all, nothing like that, right? So this is the front page. And this is the back page. Here are your ads, right? Nothing to grab your eye, nothing really to pull attention, right? And I don't have time to talk about how a newspaper is constructed, but the reason why the front page isn't where the news is. The front page, because of how ink dries in the 18th century, I can talk about that later. But the news is in the middle pages. The middle 2 pages here is where the news is, right? And again, same deal. Boring, right? The green box is the Declaration of Independence, right? If you were kind of dozing off, you'd miss it, right? So that's the beginning 2 paragraphs and the last 2 paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence, and that's as grabby as that's going to get. On the other hand, this is the secret. This foolishness is the secret weapon for the glue problem, the revolutionary mobilization problem. This is their actual secret weapon. Because newspaper production at the time, there are no reporters, there's no there's no way to actively go and pursue the news. Newspaper printers are passive receivers of news. So they get it from somebody else handing them over a piece of paper of some kind. Sometimes that's ship captains who come across the ocean and they have bags of letters, and sometimes they open some of those letters and they put some of that news in the newspaper, or word of mouth from ship captains or people that have come across the ocean and said, oh, this is what, or they're bringing newspapers from the continent of Europe with them and they can use those. They are also very reliant on people coming to them and saying, here's this letter, keep my name out of it. But here's this letter, use this part of it and put this in your newspaper. So you'll see in this boring stuff, you'll see things that say the extract of a letter from a gentleman in Boston or gentleman in Philadelphia to his friend in Boston. And the reader doesn't know that that's John Adams writing to his pal, James Warren in Boston. But that's who those people actually are. We can sort of decipher some of this stuff now. But it would take John Adams walking up to the Philadelphia newspaper and saying, take this part of my letter and put it here. And this particular message, don't put this part in, don't put that part in, right? So there are times in Adams's letters when he says, boy, these Virginians are lunatics, right? He's like, don't put that in there. But this part, that's really important stuff. So that's another way to get news into these columns. The third way is the most important way, and this is the glue solution. They take them from other people's newspapers. It's a practice called the exchanges. It's not seen as plagiarism. It's very much like how the UPI or AP Newswire would work today, or Reuters or things like that. The production of news is taken from other people's news. So if you can see here at all, you probably can't, but you'll see this says Philadelphia. This is a Philadelphia thing. What follows under that is taken from a Philadelphia newspaper, or there'll be it's called a dateline. It'll say New York, and so the reader would know this is from a New York newspaper, and only a little bit would say Williamsburg, which will only be a little bit of local news. What that means is, if you entered a story into the newspaper exchange system, it would be published as is in the same verbatim stories all over the place. And so while I was doing research on these newspapers, I sort of developed like the nerdiest superpower that you could possibly think of. Right? It's a perfect historian's, like not like invisibility or the gift of flight, right? It was, I think I can figure out what's going to be in this newspaper that I've never read before, and as I turn those sort of microfilm reel in it, there it comes. Because I was reading the same story over and over and over and over again. Same story, same sentences, same words and phrases. And I thought, I wonder how this works. I wonder what this does to the 13 clocks problem. Here's our guy, John Adams, again. A much younger John Adams. And I love this portrait of him because he's there's something up with this portrait, right? Look at this guy. He's kind of giving you a bit of a side eye. Like he knows something that he's kind of like imparting to you. And he's like, wink, right? That's why I see this. This is around the time, his portrait was done around the time that he wrote this in his diary. There's a big controversy happening in Boston about in 1769 about loyalists saying some stuff and Governor Hutchinson doing some stuff they don't like. And so John and his cousin Sam and another patriot, son of liberty, James Otis, go to Eads and Gill's Boston Gazette print shop on a Sunday, just like today. And this is what they did there. And he writes this in his diary. And I am so thankful that he did this because this was so interesting to me. The evening was spent in preparation for the next day's newspaper, a curious employment, cooking up paragraphs, articles, occurrences, etc., working the political engine. Oh, John, what are we doing? Oh, Sam, what are we doing? And if you read the next day's Boston Gazette from 1769, you have really no idea what's true and what's not true. They are seeing themselves as becoming a sort of a symbiotic, the political figures at the time are becoming a sort of symbiotic relationship with printers. Eads and Gill are also Eads is a member of the Sons of Liberty. These guys are all fast friends, but they see the importance of cooking up paragraphs because they also know what appears in the Boston Gazette will also appear in the New York Journal and the Maryland Journal and the Pennsylvania Evening Post and the Virginia Gazette and probably the South Carolina Gazette. And the same people far away from Boston will read the exact same cooked up paragraphs. Now, we might say fake news, and I think you might be right. Not all the time, but Franklin and Adams and Jefferson dabble in these things because of the big problem, because of the part one trouble of the 1770s problem. So remember, cooking up paragraphs. Oh boy. Okay. How does this work? Here's another John Adams for you, right? He writes it when he looks like the guy on the left. But what he's saying here is another episode of the guy on the right, the side-eye winky John Adams, right? In that same letter that he writes to Jefferson about young men of letters should look for print, he says this: what do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and a consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775. I don't think so, John. I think you're being side-eyed, John, when you're telling us this, because the war is going to change everything. The war is going to change everything. Now, that sentiment that the real revolutionary movement, the shift that happens in American attitudes happens long before any shots are fired in anger, becomes essential to how we have understood the American Revolution in how we've written about it all throughout the 20th century. Probably the most influential book in American historiography. One of these was The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. It won all sorts of prizes. Daniel Ellsberg kept it in his backpack when he stole the Pentagon Papers, or he procured the Pentagon Papers, because he felt like it was so important to what he thought he was doing as a patriotic act. It moved him to such a degree, this particular book. And Bernard Bailyn of Harvard University uses that quote, which Adams himself recycles a couple of times, as a leading quote in not only chapter 1, but chapter 5. What do we mean by the revolution? What do we mean by the revolution? That's John Adams for you. That idea that American attitudes had changed so much, Bernard Bailyn, who was also Mary Beth Norton's advisor, who changed so much that happened before any of the shooting started, that's when the move happened, I think is a function of that kind of side-eye Adams, because it then takes the war out of the equation. And I think the war is what is so important. We have this idea of the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War, kind of like we talk about World War II and the Holocaust as kind of separate things, but they are very much the same thing. The political changes, the constitution making of the American Revolution and the war making part of the Revolutionary War are happening at the same time and at the same moment. So Lexington and Concord and your morning bus ride in April changes everything. What I was reading when I had my super nerdy superpower was story after story after story after story about the British doing everything they possibly can to stir up or tamper with or excite people of color to take part against the revolution. That was what was there over and over and over and over again. And I was stunned. My first book is 750 pages long, which is egregiously not a good idea. But one of the reasons why is because the reason it's 700 pages long is because I wanted to reflect the amount of stuff that I was finding. Because it seemed to me that it was kind of hiding in plain sight, that it was there, but no one, because Bernard Bailyn had told us and John Adams had told us that the war had nothing to do with it. And I found all this material in the war, and it was about Adams and Franklin and Washington and Jefferson making people aware of how much the British were trying to do everything in their power to stir up people of color. These guys spent a tremendous amount of time and effort thinking about and producing stories. You know why? Because those are not controversial stories. Stories about slave insurrections or Indian massacres are so deeply ingrained in the colonial imagination and their nightmares that does tremendous amounts of political work for you that has nothing to do with how much you don't like each other's religion and how much you don't have the customs in common, but has nothing to do with the manners that you don't like each other, that the Quakers and the Puritans can all agree on. We're scared that slaves are going to rise up and kill us in the night, or the Indian massacres, like what happened in this building in 1676, is going to happen again. Those are the stories that I was reading over and over and over again. I'll give you a small selection of what they are. Canadian Governor Guy Carleton and British Indian Superintendent Guy Johnson met with natives 1,500 miles back of Quebec. Try to think in your mind about where 1,500 miles back of Quebec is, right? It's like Arctic Circle, Santa Land, right? And made them great offers to take up arms against the English colonies. That particular story, somebody put it there, was in the New Hampshire Gazette on the 11th of July, 1775, and then it appeared in the Pennsylvania Ledger, the Pennsylvania Packet, the Virginia Gazette in Norfolk, and the Virginia Gazette in Williamsburg. Why do people in Norfolk need to know about something that's happening 1,500 miles back of Quebec? And that guy actually turned it into 15,000 miles. He made a printing error. So where's 15,000 miles back of Quebec, right? All the way around on the other side? Right, no, probably pretty close to Virginia, right? That next week, there was a report in that same place that Johnson was suspected of endeavoring to stir up the Indians against the colonists. That story appears in the New York Journal on the 22nd of June, 1775, and then in the Connecticut Journal, the New England Chronicle here in Boston, Essex Gazette in Salem, and finally it appears the week after this one in that New Hampshire Gazette. So this one starts that story, and this one cleans it up in the next week. It's sort of almost a call and response about the same kind of story, reinforcing that idea. Here's a favorite. This will play in the room. Indians delivered us a speech on the 2nd, the 12th, I'm sorry, which related to the substance of all the conferences Colonel Johnson had with them last summer, where he delivered to each of the Canadian tribes a war belt and a hatchet, after which they were invited to feast on a Bostonian and drink his blood. Now we have full proof that the ministerial servants have attempted to engage the savages against us. That letter actually is written by General Philip Schuyler, and is an official report that he sends to the Continental Congress, and the Congress says, this is so good. And they send it down the street to the Pennsylvania Evening Post, and then it's in 3 more Philadelphia papers, 3 New York papers, the Annapolis paper, Baltimore, Norwich, Connecticut, 3 in Boston, which I'm sure they read with delight, Williamsburg, New London, Connecticut, and Providence, Rhode Island. Same exact, so all those people in all those places read the story about feasting on a Bostonian and drinking his blood. They also got to see this interesting thing in this story too, about how we find out about it, because it is friendly native peoples who then inform Schuyler that this is what's going on here. So there's this interesting kind of cross-cutting thing going on with that. At the same time, in the summer and fall of 1775, you have the royal governor in Virginia threatening to and then making good on his promise to promise freedom and then arms to any enslaved men who reach the governor's ship, which is he's taken in the Chesapeake Bay. Of course, it's the Emancipation Proclamation that Lord Dunmore writes, which is very close to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, certainly in spirit. A lot of women and children also show up too. And so, but we think at least 1,000 enslaved people actually respond to Dunmore's Emancipation Proclamation. It becomes another one of these kind of opportunities, a risky opportunity. What, do you publish this or not? Months before, James Madison, a young James Madison, writes to his Princeton roommate, whose father runs the Pennsylvania Journal, of which I showed you the spider webs. And he said, we should really suppress any kind of information about slave insurrections. It's not good to publicize these things because then they might get out of hand. He writes that like a month before, 2 months before Lexington and Concord. Now the paper's like, Publish away, baby. Publish away, right? Make everybody aware of what's going on here, and you have a tremendous upswell of stories upon stories upon stories about Dunmore's proclamation. And there's weird ones too. This is my favorite weird one. This is what happens to Mr. Narsworthy's plantation. You can read it here. 6 white men and 4 Negroes last week landed near Mr. Narsworthy's in the Isle of Wight County in order to carry off some sheep, which they knew were on the plantation. A Negro man who happened to be in the yard discovered another dressed in the uniform of the 14th Regiment. So that's an enslaved person dressed in a British uniform. Immediately went to informed his master that some of the governor's men were landed. He dispatched someone to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a sheep raid, and a bad one. Why would something so small and insignificant get in those small columns of the newspapers, and then Baltimore, Annapolis, Philadelphia? I read about Narsworthy's stupid sheep plantation in New York City twice, and in Hartford, Connecticut, and in New Haven, Connecticut, and in Charleston, South Carolina, and Salem, Mass. Why would in these small little columns, why would people need to know this? Well, there are a lot of images and messages packed into these kinds of things. You have enslaved people working with the governor. You also have quote unquote good slaves informing on them. So this does a lot of interesting work for the Patriots. But making people aware of this is so important. One of the people who's accused of doing a lot of these things knows what he's talking about. Now, I distrust a little bit what John Adams is talking about, but this guy has had his house pulled down in Charleston, South Carolina, and he's been exiled to Florida, which is like the worst of things that can happen to you. And he says from Florida, the newspapers were full of publications calculated. And if we wanted to change the word calculated to cooked up, feel free. To excite the fears of the people, massacres and instigated insurrections were in the mouths of every child. He writes that in December of 1775, a month or so after Dunmore's proclamation. This is what John Adams and his cousin and Ben Franklin and Patriot leaders are this is the project they're working on. They're trying to do their best to overcome these problems of the 13 clocks to make these things happen together. And just a few days after Stuart writes that letter, you see this kind of essay happen in a Virginia Gazette in January of 1776. How sunk is Britain? Could not Britons venture to wage war with America until they were told Americans were cowards? Nor even then without the assistance of Roman Catholics and Indians, and endeavoring to raise amongst us a domestic enemy. A domestic enemy is always a euphemism for enslaved people. It'll be in the Declaration of Independence. Why make use of every base and inhuman stratagem and wage a war unknown amongst civilized nations? Surely whoever's heard of Carleton and Connolly and Dunmore's plots against us cannot allow they must have been authorized by a higher power, King George. Most freely would I cut the Gordian knot. Rights, consent, representation, that's not why. This is why. By the time we get to the war, there's something else going on here too, and it's about involving what role people of color are going to play in this revolution. Here's another one from Connecticut during the time that Jefferson is writing the Declaration of Independence. The King of England delights in blood, yea, thirsteth for blood of Americans, Hessians, Hanoverians, Brunswickers. Those are foreign mercenaries. They'll also be in the Declaration. Canadians, Indians, Negroes, regulars, and Tories are invited to the carnage. This is no fiction, but an awful reality. Not the production of a delirium, but a substantial matter of fact, says someone who we don't know, named he takes the pseudonym of Armitage in the Connecticut Courant of 1776, but then it's again in Massachusetts and Maryland and New York. No. What does John Adams say on the 22nd of June? It's hard to make 13 clocks strike precisely alike, right? At the same second. You can't make them strike alike, but this is the project they've been working on. Oh my. Yeah. All right. And I am almost done. I want to talk about the you can't make it. You can. All right, let's get to this nonsense, right? I'm gonna finish up with this. I know I'm running over time. Go for it. All right, let's go. All right, sorry, Zoom. You've seen this before. This is the terrible way to look at the Declaration of Independence. This is a terrible way, right? Mostly because it's one big block of cursive handwriting, which our kids and grandchildren will not be able to read at all. But this is a much better way to look at it. And this is what, no one actually saw this until after the War of 1812, by the way. Right around 1818, 1819 is when this became an artifact. It was actually rolled up and people didn't even know it. Really, no one knew that Jefferson had anything to do with it until he ran for president in the 1790s. It was issued by Congress, but this is the way to do it, to look at it. And this is the best way to read it because you see in this broadside, which people did see in 1776, this 2 opening paragraphs, 27 reasons why the king is not to be trusted, 2 closing paragraphs, right? Student essay, introduction, body, conclusion. Good job, Jefferson. Nice job with that. 2 opening paragraphs, 27. And the next thing that I'm working on this year for 2026 is an analysis of the 27 grievances, which I'm trying to zazz up a little bit because they're pretty arcane and constitutional and boring, and I'm trying to figure out how to way to make them kind of interesting because there's some weird ones in there that certainly wouldn't make me want to take a bullet or put my family at risk to do, right? So the early ones, there's the 4th one is one of my favorites. It says that today Congress has been moved away from the Library of Congress. So that's tyranny. Right? That's really what it says. It means that the Massachusetts General Court was moved from Boston to Cambridge, and their archives were stayed in Boston, right? Well, you know how far Cambridge is from Boston. I mean, it's impossible to get there. And so that's the 4th declaration. So if I'm reading that, I'm like, yeah, let's go get those guys. No, but what's the last one? The last one is, and this does pick up speed. So the 4th one is boring and arcane, and the early ones are about the king, but they're kind of hard to piece through. But as we get here, the last few are about the war itself, the thing that Adams told us to forget about. And the last one is he has endeavored to bring on the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And he has brought on excited domestic insurrections amongst us, right? That's the last one, right? He has excited domestic insurrections and then endeavor to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers. The feast on a Bostonian and drink his blood stuff, and the Dunmore's proclamation stuff. Now, I'm okay on time? Okay. We know where Congress spent their time thinking about the Declaration. Jefferson, they vote on the 2nd of July, and they spend all the 2nd and the 3rd of July editing this document. Where did they make their changes? Would suggest where we think that they thought was the most important stuff that they needed to get right, right? That's where they spent their time and effort honing in on this document. So the beginning paragraphs pretty much enter in the same as Jefferson's rough draft. Right? There's a few changes here and there. Franklin makes a few changes. Adams suggests a few things, right? But you see here, there's a few little snippets, a few little cuts, little changes of thing. Here's the beginning of the grievances, right? Pretty much as is. Pretty much as is. Here and there, a few things. John Adams is the guy, by the way, who introduces the whole Library of Congress one. It's not Jefferson's like, oh, whatever, man, make you guys happy, right? But here's the last one. What should have been the last grievance against the Declaration is a wholesale screed against slavery that Jefferson writes. He refers to slavery as an assemblage of horrors. He refers to it as piratical warfare. He takes the gloves off, and just like we do with texting, if you see capital letters, it's shouting at you. There are capital letters in Jefferson's rough draft. He is yelling impassionately about slavery. And think about what would have happened if that would have stayed in the document as is, but it doesn't, kind of. All of that gets this, right? This is how this should have read, right? Not he has endeavored, he has engaged domestic insurrections against us. It says this: he waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, and the persons of distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, only to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined that he keep open a market where men be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative, for that suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit, to restrain this execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors may want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise amongst us. That beginning of that is the great object of desire. That is, Jefferson is yelling about that abolition of slavery, and Congress goes, no, 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 no. Let's cross all that out. The end where he says, and now he is exciting, they say, oh, that works. And they keep Dunmore's proclamation, and they cut out all of the stuff. Think about what abolitionists would have done. Think about what Frederick Douglass or Wendell Phillips would have done with the Declaration of Independence calling slavery an assemblage of horrors and piratical warfare. It would have given them so much more than all men are created equal. It would have given them weapons to fight in the 1850s in different ways. But it's gone. And why is it gone? Union. 13 clocks, got to make them strike together. You cannot, because there are these different reasons why people are in the room. You've got to tread on you have to tread on very, very careful ground. And the carefulest of ground is about making people afraid of race and fear. That's the easiest stuff to do. So that's what sticks there. We don't know how people responded to the Declaration, and this is the very end. We don't know how people respond to the Declaration, or which part of it they went, yeah, like Library of Congress, right? They probably didn't do that. But we know we have a reflection from a group on Long Island. And this could be Long Islanders being nutty, but I don't think so, right? Once the Declaration was read out loud to them in July of 1776, the crowd did this next. They made an effigy of George III and hastily fabricated out of base materials, with his face blackened like Dunmore's Virginia regiment, its head adorned with a wooden crown, and its head stuck full of feathers like Carleton and Johnson's savages, feast on a Bostonian, and wrapped in the Union Jack instead of a blanket or a robe of state, and lined with gunpowder, which the original seems so fond of, was hung on a gallows, exploded, and burned to ashes. They enact that 27th grievance that they've read and heard so much about in 1775 and 1776. Now, why this matters so much, I said I'd do how questions, but why this matters is because the American people decided they didn't want to be under a monarch anymore. They wanted to become citizens and not be subjects anymore. They made that choice. When the Continental Congress tells all the states to draft state constitutions right before they draft the Declaration of Independence, and they give them one rule: no kings, no aristocrats, no kings, no dukes or lords or royal government. You can make whatever state constitution you want. You can have you can have it be unicameral, bicameral, you can have governors do this and that, just no kings, right? They made a choice to have subjects, not citizens. Because of that, a citizenship is a club where we decide who's in and who's out. In a subject, the king, we are all part of the king's body, right? We are all subjects together. Only the king, he or queen, can decide who's part of that body politic. We decide who's in and who's out. So now when you're at the very time when you are creating this idea of we hold these truths to be self-evident, who's we? We are the ones who get to decide. And I think this is why this matters so much. We've seen fear and race play such an important part of American politics, certainly in the last 25 years, including today, right? What's happening in Madison Square Garden today is about race and fear and politics, right? It should not surprise us that this happened in 1775, but the legacies of that, because it's tied into this founding, are so important. the we hold these truths to be self-evident, the we of who is the American people, I think this played a role in saying this, we didn't want to, we came together to keep away the threat of enslaved people and native peoples. That's what made the glue possible. And that's why these founding stories are so important, I think. These founding stories about colonial nightmares, slave insurrections, Indian massacres, they merge with nation-making stories and Republican stories. And so what 13 Clocks is sort of talks about more than I have time to do here is about the legacies and the consequences of these founding stories and how that particular kind of glue would have devastating consequences as we move into the 19th and 20th century. All right, that's enough of that. I'm staying here. I have to stay here. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay.
Question and answers, both from the in-person audience and the online audience.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I went over time. Oh, I went way over time. I'm sorry. Ah, well, there you go. I'll take that as a review. Yeah.
Do I get an A?
Yes, of course. What? Nobody? I've stunned you into silence. Yeah.
Wait, you get
Oh, yeah.
In the conclusion of the book, that were mercenaries who were given a path to citizenship
Right.
in the United States, the Hessians.
Yes.
What was the reason behind that? Because they obviously took up arms against the Patriots.
Absolutely.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Situation.
So I could want me to go start again? Okay, I'll start again. And just start with because I remember having a meeting with my dissertation advisor, and he said, and I was talking about all these things, and he said, you got to include the Hessians because they are the counter story. They are brought here specifically for this purpose of killing Americans. And in 1775 and 1776, there's a lot of fear of, actually, originally they were supposed to be Russians. The original call was to Catherine the Great of Russia and to say, can you send us 10,000? So instead of the Germans are coming, it should have been the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. And she says, niet. So then they turned it to the Germans. Until Trenton ends all of that fear. What happens at the Battle of Trenton when 900 or so of them are taken prisoner? This is in many ways why you see the importance of these exchanges in this print, because all of a sudden after Trenton, the Hessians just disappear. Whereas all of these efforts, whenever the Patriot leadership feels extraordinarily vulnerable and threatened, that's when these stories about people of color tick up, and you see them more and more and more. Benjamin Franklin creates this whole hoax about bags of scalps in 1782 because he's really concerned that the American people are going to compromise at the peace treaty, which he's going to take part of. He wants to stir this back up again and remind people about how terrible these things are. That never happens with the Hessians. After Trenton, they're seen as kind of foolish. Why were afraid of them in the first place? And for me, that pathway to them, and a number, so about 12,000 or so of them come over, and a great number of them stay. And their pathway to citizenship is not blocked. Where it is for, even free Black people are not seen as American citizens, but Germans are fine. And in the 1780s, one of those people who gets arrested or captured at Trenton is a fifer named Philip File, who comes up with the music of the President's March, which is today the Vice President's song, not Hail to the Chief, but Hail to the Chief for the Vice President. And it was Hail Columbia was the song, and the words were written by one of those captured Trenton musicians. And so you see the pathways are not blocked for them. So it's also the stories that are not told as much as the stories that are told, which kind of really sort of so that becomes really important. It's about choice, and what the things that you do talk about when you're cooking up paragraphs matters. The things you don't talk about actually matters too, if that makes sense. Yeah, and you see this also for Native peoples who support the revolution. right? They're basically not talked about at all. There's very little ink, and does them very little good. Or even free Black people, they don't really appear very much, other than helping out Mr. Norsworthy. Yeah.
Jefferson reconciled his public statement with his personal behavior of holding slaves.
Ah, okay. He goes to France and he's transformed. That's really the short answer to that. Jefferson is a loud opponent of slavery. Again, even though he has inherited a number of enslaved people at Monticello, and then he goes to France. And my advisor, Peter Onuf, and his co-author, Annette Gordon Reed, wrote this lovely book that you should all read called The Most Blessed of the Patriarchs. And they talk about this, and they say it's actually him going to France, where he's so far away from Virginia and the slave codes, where he has no control of the enslaved people who he takes with him to his household, and he has to become a very different kind of slaveholder. And after he comes back, he never again says anything really about slavery. He justifies it in his mind as becoming himself a good slave owner. And if we all did that, slavery would end, as opposed to a political solution to the whole problem. He makes it a personal solution to the problem. But it is that experience of being in France and being away from Virginia. And then, of course, what also starts there is his relationship with Sally Hemings, which and a lot of the people that he does have this relationship with are sort of extended members of his own family. So that, I think, is the real breaking point for Jefferson. But at this time, he wants there to be a political solution to this, even though it would hurt him financially. But Jefferson, like Washington, inherits from dad, and especially from marrying well, much more than or both of them are marrying well, much more than they make themselves. Yeah.
There were populations in the colonies who did not use English.
Yeah.
How were they informed of this?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. No, the first printing of the Declaration of Independence is in German. Heinrich Müller, who runs a German press out of Germantown, Pennsylvania, is the first. He gets it and translates it on like I think the 5th or the 6th of July. There are a number of very pro-German speaking. There's a couple of German-speaking newspapers, but the Patriots work really hard to try to convince folks who are living far away from these kind of information networks or are not English speaking. They spend a lot of time doing that. They send missions into sort of what's today upcountry South Carolina to try to evangelize the Patriot press orally, because people are not literate. They sponsor and pay for German speakers to go into those kind of communities and try to evangelize the Patriot way. So they're doing it in print. They're also doing it orally, but they spend so much time because, to me, it speaks from weakness, not strength. That they're spending the time and money to do this. And this is where I think Mary Beth and I disagree. I think it comes from a place of weakness, that they're afraid of it, because for them it's or die. So we have to do everything we can to kind of stitch this snake together with very, very thin thread. But yes, that's there are a number of sort of foreign language things that are also participating in this too. And I would love to know more about that. I have folders. When Franklin is an ambassador in France, he starts a pro-American newspaper in Paris. It's all in French, and I don't speak French or read French. But I'm trying to pay for some students to do that, to see what all's in those kind of Parisian newspapers about the American stuff, to see how much this might even extend across the Atlantic. Yeah.
It's an interesting take-home message from your grads, how fragmented the news biz was in those days. Having spent an academic period in Philadelphia, and there's I guess, tendency to sort of deify Franklin.
Right.
And one thing that I'd like to get a sense of is the perception that the Pennsylvania Gazette was sort of the newspaper of record
Right.
for the colonies and for the Continental Congress. Do you agree with that perception?
Yeah, it's the gold standard. It's the oldest one that's still in business at that time. There is a little bit of it. So one thing that I could also talk about too is the Patriots spend a lot of time in 1775 and 1776 shutting down any opposition to themselves with force. Loyalist newspapers. James Rivington in New York City gets run out of town, and his printing press is destroyed. The way that Dunmore is able to print Dunmore's proclamation is because he raids that Norfolk, the one that turned it into 15,000 thing. He takes that printing press and puts it on a ship, and that's how he's able to make the Emancipation Proclamation. Both sides see printing presses as weapons. And in 1775, neutral or even pro-crown papers go out of business, or there's some suspicious fires that happen. The Gazette is probably the best one. It's a little bit less pro-patriot by this much than the Pennsylvania Journal, which was run by the Bradford family. But the newspaper business is a terrible business financially for printers. Franklin only becomes wealthy enough to retire once he gets the government contract to print the money, the currency, and the assembly's laws. That before that, he's right next door to broke all throughout until he gets that. And then he says, well, now I can become a politician, and he becomes the governor or the agent for the colony of Massachusetts in Pennsylvania. But until then, he can't. And so you have to be very precise about losing those subscribers that you see out on the countryside. You can't make them mad. You can't do what Jeff Bezos did this week and not take a side, literally not take a side and get everybody so mad at you that they cancel their subscriptions, so they never pay you. The margins are so thin that they don't have the capability to do that. So that also tells you that they have to be really sort of on the pulse of politically in the 1770s of where their consumer base is. And the best ones do a really good job of that. And the guys who take over for Franklin, Hall and Sellers, are really good at that. And some of the other Pennsylvania ones are, some of them aren't, and they go out of business. And by the way, after the British take New York City, the Patriots start to lose their monopoly on print. And you have the English who are it's starting to dawn on them what they need to do about hearts and minds more. They start founding royal gazettes in New York City. When they go to Philadelphia and occupy that city, they found a Royal Pennsylvania Gazette. When they go to South Carolina, they found like 3 newspapers down there. And it doesn't seem to me to be a coincidence that wherever that happens, the war gets to be really, really ugly and frazzled. And there's a lot of problems. If you know anything about the revolution in the South, it is a brutal mess. One of the reasons why is the Patriots lose their monopoly voice about telling you how to think about things. There's a competing voice now, and there's a lot of illiterate people. And that, I think in many ways, it kind of proves my point. By 1780, some of these messages aren't hitting home in direct ways like they were before. All right, question now.
That's timely because I'm going to go to South Carolina.
All right.
I was rudely scrolling on my phone, but the reason was that something just hit home. I was looking at my 5th great grandfather, who was a Virginian who went down to South Carolina and was massacred by Indians on July 1, 1776, along with his family.
Oh.
and I've
and
always,
the Cherokees.
and that's something
Must have been.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I've always been surprised at the press that got. It was gruesome.
You bet.
And now I'm going to go back and look and see those newspapers
Yes.
and see to what extent they lined up.
Right. So there is a threat that the Cherokee, I mean, the guy who gets exiled to Florida, he is accused of stirring up the Cherokees and Creeks in South Carolina. And they raid his house and they look for any kind of smoking gun evidence of this. And he runs to St. Augustine really fast. So in August of 1776, some of these Virginians write to Jefferson and inform him about what happens in the sort of what's today the South Carolina, where all the bad things happened with the hurricane, sort of that South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee border. That's where that happens. And Jefferson writes, maybe, I don't know, 3-4 weeks after the Declaration of Independence, we should exterminate them. He uses that language and says, and anybody who we can't get to, we should push them to the other side of the Mississippi River, which is, Andrew Jackson is 13 years old when he wants to do that later on. And Jefferson's already talking about that. So Jefferson is writing these very, he might talk about a great object of desire about enslaved peoples, but he wants to punish any native people that work with the British and really make an example of them. And that's probably exactly where that happened and when that happened, but all at the same moment. Ooh, back row.
I'm not clear about this. Slavery was illegal in England.
Yeah.
Slavery was illegal in England.
Yeah.
However, the ships were British that brought many of the slaves here.
Yes.
And then the king wouldn't let us tax these ships because I understand he wants us to have slaves, but the people in Britain, did they not know what the king was doing? There seems to be a confusion.
Yeah, right. That's the part of this. It becomes a really important part of the British economy. The British commercial economy is the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, it makes people in Liverpool and Bristol and London so much money, in Glasgow, so much money. And they're putting pressure as much as it's making people who have deep political connections in the West Indies, in Jamaica and Barbados, they're putting pressure on any kind of movement for the crown to limit this at all. So this is becoming a big political problem in England. You have a growing abolitionist movement, but they are fighting against this behemoth economic enterprise that is making a lot of money about the transatlantic slave trade. And so this is a fight that's going on in Britain 75 years before it becomes a real fight in the United States, which abolitionists eventually win. In 1807, they abolished the slave trade, and in 1833 they abolished slavery in the Caribbean or any part of their empire. But this is an ongoing fight for a couple of generations that they're going to do. So there's a mixed message, right? Some people think the king, why would we limit this at all? Some people say, no, there's a moral element to it, and religion's going to play a big role in that. Does that clear it up? It's complicated.
Awesome. Well, I think more, but maybe that's a good place to end. Where
What?
we've got one
Oh,
more.
a comment?
A comment.
Oh, okay.
You like that?
Okay. Okay. I stand ready to listen.
Ready?
Uh-huh.
I think I probably speak for everyone. It's a pleasure to hear a historian who is accessible.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And you've made it all come alive. And it's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Anything from Zoom? Nothing? Okay. But we're good on Zoom? You did it? Yay.
Thank you again, Professor Parkinson. And this concludes today's lecture series. Please join us on the first floor for refreshments at the gift shop. Thank you.
I'm glad you could come. You know, it's a love hanging outside.
Thank you so much to our online audience, and we'll see you on November 17th.
All right.
You got some thank yous.
Yeah.
That was fabulous. Thank
Like that's real, okay.
It's a fairly short walk to the common.
I think the weather's.
Yeah. Parents could maybe go.
Are we gonna see that stage?
Drive, they have something on the white track.
A little bit white, I like that.
Yeah. I think the
Battle
ferry,
traffic and parking.
check out the ferry schedule, and it's about a 35-minute boat ride.
Okay,
And
that's.
and then give yourself maybe 10 minutes to walk. What hotel is it again?
It's the Revere Hotel.
Yeah, it's not, it shouldn't be that far of a walk. Yeah, that's what I.
Okay, that's good. Okay, that gets me, some.
Yeah.
What a great. Animating.
Yeah.